I think endpoints are hard to hack now, which means the bad guys are going to find more creative ways of getting into your organization, of living off the land, so they don't have to go up to your oh-so-fancy endpoints that are hardened and are running, of course, the most secure operating system that Microsoft or Apple ever has created.
Welcome back to Breach Banter, the podcast where we challenge buzzwords, decode vendor hype, and talk real-world cybersecurity for MSPs. So I'm Kristian Wright, CEO at Enhanced.io, and I'm once again joined by Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO of Inversion 6 and CTO of Octopi. In episode 2, we're breaking down one of the most misunderstood acronyms in the industry, XDR, and specifically OpenXDR. Most vendors use it, few explain it, and most still rely solely on endpoint detection. Ian helps us cut through the noise to define what OpenXDR really is, why endpoint-only security is no longer enough, and how MSPs can gain full visibility across their attack surface. So welcome back to Breach Banter, the podcast where cybersecurity meets real talk for MSPs. I'm Kristian Wright, I'm CEO of Enhanced.io, and today we're unpacking one of the most misunderstood acronyms in security, which is XDR, specifically OpenXDR. Now, vendors love to slap XDR on just about anything these days, but under the surface, most of it still revolves around endpoint detection. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Endpoint-only security leaves up to about 70% of your attack surface unprotected. That includes things like cloud, identity, lateral movement paths, and unmanaged assets, all of which attackers are actively targeting. So today I'm joined once again by Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Inversion 6 and CTO of Octopi. And he's going to very kindly break down what OpenXDR really is, how it fits into the modern MSP stack, and whether it lives up to the hype. So I'm going to dive straight in. Ian, let's start simple. What is OpenXDR in plain English?
Well, okay, the somewhat jaded part of me would say it's a single pane of glass for all of your security ever. Okay, but it's a little bit more than that. I have to be honest. So what it's an attempt to do is to allow a customer or an MSP a flexibility in the tools that they're choosing. And then, maybe everyone doesn't need, Sentinel-1 on endpoints. Maybe it can be a mixture of different solutions that are out there for the endpoint detection response, Microsoft Defender being one of the big popular ones, depending on your Microsoft licensing level. But, there's others. There's things like Bitdefender and Nebula and from Malwarebytes. So what it's an attempt to do is to try and put together all of these disparate endpoint solutions, add a bunch of, I'm going to call it telemetry, because we can get into what exactly that is, and give you a coherent picture of the security posture of the organization. Now, Kristian, this has been elusive, all right? From the outside, there's an entire industry called continuous attack surface monitoring, which is like probing the outside based on your public DNS and other things that it can infer about your infrastructure. But internally, it's a really complex situation because there might be hosts that are isolated that have a very small window of communication that they use, maybe only a couple of ports are open on them. They're isolated. You're talking about OT environments. You're talking about deliberately restricting a lot of infrastructure inside your organization from getting to the outside. And sometimes the only way to monitor those particular types of devices is with a feed from a switch port into a SIEM or SOAR. And so the complexity of modern networks being what they are, you're 100% right that if you just focused on an EDR solution, you're going to be missing a whole bunch of other potentially dangerous activity. Like in the case of the MGM Grand Hotel hack, someone got into the fish tank and was able to laterally move in the organization. And this brings up another really difficult truth. EDR can be defeated. There's a lot of different applications out there and techniques that can be used, including Windows PowerShell and things like that, to turn or disable the EDR off. So again, now we're back to detecting that something's wrong with one of our security solutions. So long story short, Open XDR is a way of trying to kind of get all of the best of breed security software into one coherent picture of your cybersecurity posture.
And that's a great explanation. Thank you. And why do you think this term's exploded over the last couple of years? Because I know from our perspective, we've been running an open XDR solution for about 6 years now. And I remember back at the start, no one was that interested or even understood the term or had heard of the term. So what do you think's driving that sort of open XDR everywhere at the moment?
I think it's becoming quickly apparent that threat actors, especially when it comes to ransomware as a service actors, are living off the land, are looking like administrators within your organization or people with privileged access. And there's a lot of info stealing going on in the browsers. And one of the only ways of determining that you've got a breach or that you are in the process of being breached is really to look at that telemetry. The EDR might say everything is fine, but you might see a whole bunch of network connections to Pakistan, which would be deeply suspicious if you have no customer relationship with Pakistan, no supply chain relationship with Pakistan. That would be very suspicious indeed. So I think there's a call now to understand that the threat actors have gotten more sophisticated, that EDR bypass is a real thing, and that putting all of our eggs into one vendor's security basket just doesn't cut it anymore. Because there are a lot of attack vectors that don't really come into account the latest and greatest endpoint detection. And I think, honestly, the biggest success story here is the endpoint success story. I think endpoints are hard to hack now, okay? Which means the bad guys are going to find more creative ways of getting into your organization, of living off the land, so they don't have to go up to your oh so fancy endpoints that are hardened, and are running, of course, the most secure operating system that Microsoft or Apple ever created.
I mean, in terms of how this fits together for an MSP, I'd say a lot of MSPs that we speak to feel quite overwhelmed by the sheer number of tools, the overlapping tool sets that they maybe have taken on board or are looking at. So for them, for an MSP, is OpenXDR just more noise, would you say, or can it bring clarity? Where would it sit? How would it work for an MSP looking to evaluate what tool set they should be using going forward?
I really think it comes down to understanding your customer, what their functions are, what their technology maturity is, what some of their internal policies are. Take, for example, an organization that's got local administrative privileges everywhere, right? That number one problem right there is where you're going to need more sophisticated technology, because it will be a lot easier to hack an organization than it's got robust identity and access management and RBAC, role-based authentication controls, in place. So to me, as an MSP, where you've got a diversity of different technologies, a diversity of different security risk profiles for those organizations, some may be regulated, some might not be. This is where customization of your security package to sort of be commercially palatable comes into play. It would be nice to be able to standardize everything. And in the MSP world, we were beaten over the head that standardization was like the magic bullet, right? But the reality was, quite frankly, nothing's standard. Unless you've rebuilt every single network from scratch and put your entire stack on it, you might be inheriting somebody's other's mess. I think in my 20 years plus of MSP experience, I've done 4 or 5 from greenfield network builds, right? The rest of the time, they've been customers that have been frustrated with their previous IT support, either in-house or as an MSP, and I've inherited that mess. And then I present them with a technology roadmap, which includes the security stack items, and start with the firewall and then move into the organization and start collecting telemetry and move it into a SIEM and SOAR. But you can't do that if you're locked into one security ecosystem.
Do you think there's a particular area that MSPs are running blind? I mean, I know what you're saying, it's a broad spectrum, but, it's cloud identity, lateral movement. Are those big gaps that you would say MSPs are leaving open if they're just sticking with endpoint or they haven't considered a whole of network sort of policy?
There is so much built into the hood of the modern operating systems, including Windows Server 2022 and even 2019 and some of the older versions of the workstations as well, 10 and 11. There's so much capability there. But MSPs, for some reason, find it somewhat elusive or hard to leverage those items. And I'll give you a great example. Audit policies on domain controllers that are then pushed up to some sort of SIEM SOAR to look for lateral movement, to look for invoke PowerShell on a payroll workstation. Deeply suspicious stuff. Right. And so I think, like, when I start thinking about the attack surface of my customers, when I start thinking about, the biggest problems in cyber, right? If the part of your cyber defenses is really reactive, so EDR on the endpoint and say even consuming the domain controller logs, but if they've got, gobbles of like email and user IDs out on the dark web with, possibly valid passwords for their organization, all the security in the world at that point isn't going to stop the determined attacker, especially if it's a privileged, account. Just ask Marks and Spencer, right? It then becomes, a privileged user that's actually doing these malicious activities. And the first thing they can do is download something and install it to get rid of the EDR that might be pestering them.
I mean, there's another narrative going on I've heard recently, which is OpenXDR, is it just SIEM or SIEM, depending where you are in the world, 2.0, or kind of SIEM in a hoodie? Do you buy that? Is it actually something new, or is it just an evolution of what we had before?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's the potential stepping stone for automation and AI integration. And I think those are the two areas that MSPs, if I'm up on my soapbox talking, to GTIA or CompTIA, I'm starting to talk about automation for profit. It's not, the profitable MSP is the one that can afford security for their customers, right? So part of my shtick, if you will, is to say, listen, we can do the basics. And the basics, 3 to 5 years ago would ward off the worst of it. But the basics now aren't going to stop the attackers that we're seeing today. Just quite simply, they will get in, they will live off the land, and they will ruin your day. So, we have to think more comprehensively. And maybe, part of this whole discussion is the bigger picture of being able to, treat a failed backup as a priority one call that comes up on the security console, instead of looking at it just as a standalone backup implementation, something that can take in tickets from a disparate amount of different stuff, right? And then say, oh, look, a new device was hooked into this switch port, which of course raises the question, why wasn't that switch port disabled in the first place? But, I'll get on my soapbox about, proactive versus reactive. But I think the more an MSP can use these new tools to push out proactivity, and then create tickets if your information is found in have I been pwned, to rotate credentials and things like that, all becomes part of a really robust cybersecurity offering, which MSPs need to embrace. Because they're one bad hacking on a customer from like losing that customer in a lot of cases. Many MSPs work incredibly hard, offer super big discounts, and work round the clock to get a hacked customer back online. But hey, I'm going to tell you, and I think, Kristian, there is an easier way.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And actually, talking of tools, a phrase I hear often at the moment is tool sprawl. And talking with MSPs, they do feel, well, what often's happened is maybe that one of the tech team's gone out, seen a shiny new tool, kind of said, oh, we need to get this. So do you think MSPs are over tooling, including OpenXDR in this conversation, but do you think they're over tooling without improving any actual outcome, or is it just more and more tools and less actual oversight of what's going on?
So this is where, again, it's going to soapbox. This is very typical of a mid-market MSP, where the main technical person is also the business owner. You have to have two hats. I learned this the hard way, right? You have to either be understanding the business of being an MSP, and then understanding the impact of a tool set and those particular costs and the return on investment, right? You need to know, like, one of the fundamental KPIs that we're all taught by Robin Robbins and Carl Kapachik and all the other big gurus when it comes to MSP is about understanding the cost of your service to the customer. How much does it cost you? And you can put yourself into a really terrible predicament by having, a best in breed that you've standard on across all your customers, which provides great value for maybe 2 or 3 regulated customers, but provides, not as much value because it's just not appropriate for a 3-person hair salon. Right. And that's the reality that is not needed. A 3-person hair salon where they have like literally 2 apps, right? And they don't surf the internet because you turned that off because you're a mean MSP. But I guess my point is that's why we put in public Wi-Fi access. Put your phone on that, put your tablet on that, but don't play on the network that makes that company money. So I think there are some realities in the industry. And do I feel that MSPs that are maybe looking for an easy solution for all of their customers? I don't think it exists. I think we're into a world now where we have to customize the stack appropriately for the level of risk that that customer has.
Sure. So in that respect, then, would you see OpenXDR as a path to consolidating those tools, or rather than just another tool in the stack?
If you could get a report that said all of your different AVs, so Defender, Nebula, Sentinel-1 or CrowdStrike, if you could get a report that said all of these are up to date, or these are the machines that don't have an up-to-date signature across one thing, that automatically creates a ticket and then distributes those tickets amongst the work of your technicians, I think that to me is like the nirvana, right? Rather than one console for Malwarebytes, one console for CrowdStrike, one console, right? And that you're having to go back and forth between all of that. So yes, I do think that there's an opportunity, but I also think that where the money starts really impacting is you got to go that next step. You got to move from an open XDR solution to inputting into whatever you're using for the actual service delivery part of your business. And if that means super ops, if that means, Jira or what's the other massive ticketing system that a lot of people use? I forget.
Autotask?
Autotask, right. Whatever you're actually, ServiceNow, that was the one. Whatever you're using has to really incorporate the idea of like workflow and to create value and efficiency. And if you start going down that road, I really think you're in good shape.
Okay. And if you're an MSP and you're actively evaluating OpenXDR, it's come onto your radar from whichever vendors you deal with or who you're talking to. What do you think are the first 3 questions you should ask? Or doesn't need to be 3 questions. Any questions that you should be asking that vendor about their OpenXDR solution?
Write down like what it can natively do and compare that to what you have as your tech stack, right? You shouldn't have to be in a position where you have to throw out a bunch of stuff or that it's going to create a blind spot for you, right? So go in prepared with with an understanding of your infrastructure. So if you're rolling with Ubiquity, for instance, can it consume logs from Ubiquity? In which case, which logs specifically? How does it do that, right? And then of course, the big thing is, what does the horizon look like for your product improvements? Like, what more are you going to incorporate into it? I think that's really important. And the third one is, give me 3 references or I'm not even going to talk to you about it. I want to know MSPs about my size that have successful implementations so I can talk to them and ask, did this add value to your business? In which case, how did it add value?
So do you think if the MSP should expect to replace existing tools with OpenXDR, or basically be, rather than ripping it out, looking to integrate what you have and make the most of your layered security offering?
Well, I think it's an evolutionary process. I think the MSP today is looking for business value and protection and trying to balance the two to maintain profitability. We can go out and we can spend 20, 30 quid per endpoint quite easily on security tools. And then you have to wonder, well, is there a solution that maybe introduces a tiny bit more risk, but it's 10, right? It's an order of magnitude, or at least, it's 66% cheaper than what we had and only gives you a tiny bit of incremental risk. So I think we need to get better at doing those calculations and understanding of it. And, maybe the Windows native stack, when all of the machines have been kiosked in, my fictional hair salon, that maybe the attack surface for that is so low that you can get away with Microsoft Defender. Just keep it up to date and maybe consume some logs that look for really hinky things, right? But whereas if you've got an international law firm as a client with 3 or 4 different offices, totally different ballgame. And that comes back to my number one point. It doesn't matter unless somebody is looking at it. And this comes down to the fact that once you start down that road of cybersecurity, think very carefully around the staffing costs and the training that you're going to need. This is why I believe that managed detection and response and SOC-as-a-Service, like the business that you're in, the business that I'm in, at different levels, of course, but I think those businesses are there because it's overwhelming for many organizations from both an expense and also a delivering on business initiatives, i.e. digital transformation projects, to now look at a more complex security environment. And to be fair, the appetite for the already busy IT staff just may not be there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's something we see a fair bit of, actually. It's finding, retaining staff, training them. The finding them is particularly difficult at the moment. And often that's, there can be a large investment if you were to buy your own open XDR tool. You're talking big enterprise upfront payments. That's before you even get to the staffing aspect.
100% on the staffing and training, and everything is changing. Cyber criminals are innovating. They're using new techniques. They're really pushing the envelope in terms of like how they're attacking. So, you've got to stay on top of it. And this is why, behind every great SIEM offering is a CTI offering that is helping that business discover the vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and what might be over the horizon in terms of an attacker. So I think it's now, it's much more of a solution than it ever was and less of a product.
I think it's something that MSPs need to maybe look at baking into their overall solution for as horses for courses, as you say. If it's an international law firm or something, there's a whole different ball game there. And the last thing you want is sort of XDR shelfware where you've bought it and it sits there, never actually delivering any value. How many MSPs have you come across using OpenXDR? Is it something that your peers are sort of talking about? Is it on the horizon?
The majority of the kind of journey, if you will, now is twofold. So a lot of MSPs I know in the mid-market are going into the realm of a managed detection and response service. Okay. Probably limited to endpoint visibility. All right. Some MSPs are migrating to their own SOC. But the problem with building your own SOC and not using a SOC-as-a-Service is if you need to scale it, it becomes incrementally more expensive. Whereas a business that's built solely to provide, SOC-as-a-Service is already going to have the capacity to bring more on. And then, as I like to say, it becomes a their problem and not a your problem, right? And I think that's really important so that MSPs can go consistently to market and say, yes, we have 24/7 by 365 coverage. We've got a follow the sun SOC partner that we've partnered up with. We can provide you references. This is the indicative pricing of what it would look like for your organization. And then if that organization does an M&A, if that organization, suddenly doubles in size, you're like, well, that's not my MSP problem. That's the SOC provider, and we'll revisit that territory when we get to it. So I feel like it gives you a more flexible option and limits the amount of investment up front, and it will allow you to grow without putting your capital at risk, or as I like to say, it negatively impacting your cash flow.
Yes, absolutely. So do you feel, there's one key question that MSP should ask before going down an open XDR path? If you could boil it down to one thing, what would that be?
It is so, like, I guess it's how does their internal triaging and alert process work? Because I don't want a ton of false positives, but I do want, actionable things pushed out to me. And I think it's really important to differentiate between, like, I don't want to be woken up in the night saying that you've solved a problem. I want to be woken up in the night that you've detected a problem, and it seems to be the culprit isn't something that partner can access at the moment. So whether or not it's a TV that looks like it's been compromised, somebody brought it in from their home and put it into work, and it is phoning out to obnoxious places, or your threat intel feed is blocking some of the network traffic because it sees really hinky IP addresses. Those are the type of things that are like need to be dealt with in a timely manner, but maybe don't have to, are not 5 alarm fires. But obviously, something like a ransomware outbreak that the organization that you've partnered with manages to contain is a great news story for both your MSP and your customer.
Sure, absolutely. And I think, context is everything as well here. So, in theory, OpenXDR should make you faster at detecting, smarter at responding, and leaner in your operations. And really, if it's not doing that, I would say myself, it's not probably worth it. If it's increasing, or it's doing the opposite of that, then you're just adding more stress.
I think, though, to that point, the MSP has to have their shit together too, right? In that if I give you a really noisy, ugly network, you're going to get a ton of false positives, right, off of that, but if I'm lean and clean and I've got like good builds and, I've done some hardening and things like that, I can pop a signal to noise ratio that, that truly will be able to be actionable and visible. And so I think that's the other thing too. I mean, some MSPs need to really look at the quality of their work and be at a sufficient level of maturity in order to even entertain this. So it doesn't magically push you to the front of the line in terms of cybersecurity if, your networks are rubbish and are running out of date stuff, right? Like,
yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit like the old days of when you chucked an RMM system in, perhaps, and then got drowned by 2 million alerts coming back.
We've all been
it's
there.
The same problem. It's the same thing. And I know we do a lot of work in onboarding in terms of hardening and tuning to minimize those alerts. And all of those things need to be completely agree with you, need to be taken into account. Otherwise, you're just going to be swamped by more stuff. Yeah, which nobody wants. I think that's pretty much a wrap for episode 2. Unless you've got any other final thoughts, Ian, or have you, on this very hot day, exhausted your OpenXDR repertoire?
I would just say to MSPs is be open to new ideas, because I think it's really important for your business to not stagnate on, particular pieces of technology or wed yourself to a particular solution that's out on the marketplace. Be flexible and agile, and understand that the most important part of this is, a great customer experience for your customer and value for your MSP. And those should be sort of the key go-to-market ways of expressing an interest in newer technologies in the cybersecurity realm, for sure.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Ian. Thank you. Well, thank you again, as always, for your no-nonsense insights. So if this has helped you rethink your security stack, please share it with your team, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Breach and Banter.
Bye-bye.